everybody, it's 11 o'clock. Class will now begin. Okay, I want to start off by mentioning or reminding you all of what the Moreau reflex and the Babinski reflex are, just because I realized that I explained them while the videos were up, so they got deleted from the YouTube video. So just to quickly remind you all, the Babinski is the one where you stroke the baby's foot and its toes spread in a particular pattern. The Moreau is when the baby is dropped backwards, not like dropped like this, but dropped backwards and the arms fling out. So for those of you who didn't make it last time, that's what those two refer to. So we'll start with where we left off, which is Piaget's stages. Sensory motor, which is 0 to 2, according to Piaget. The pre-operational, which is 2 to 7. The concrete operational, which is 7 to 12. And the formal operational, which is 12 plus. So during the sensory motor stage, the baby's primary, and someone else, these are years. So 0 to 2 years, 2 to 7 years, etc. During the sensory motor stage, so sensory means having to do with the senses, motor means having to do with movement. So they're not really having or developing rich concepts. They're mainly interacting with the world by observing it and by moving with it, grabbing things, putting them in their mouth, stuff like that. And as we saw, Piaget argued that during that stage, object permanence develops, which is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you do not see them. We got partway through the pre-operational stage, so that is marked by the beginning of simple language capacities, which around 2 is when babies start to learn that. Kids in this stage are marked by egocentrism, which is the same thing as saying they have no theory of mind. Someone asked what the difference is between these, and one is essentially defined in terms of the other. Egocentrism is the inability to understand that other people have different minds from yours, meaning they have different beliefs, different desires, etc. So theory of mind is not like a scientific theory, it's an everyday folk theory. We all, at least most of us when we grow up, have theory of mind, which just means we have the understanding that other people know things that we don't know and that we know things that they don't know. And when you have tests that measure theory of mind capacities, kids in the kind of first half of the pre-operational stage tend to not do very well. Theory of mind is usually developed in the latter half of the pre-operational stage. The concept that marks the boundary between the pre-operational and the concrete operational stage is conservation. So, this is potentially confusing. So, object permanence and theory of mind develop in the middle of these two stages. The boundary between this one and this one is language. The boundary between this one and this one is conservation. So conservation is like, conservation is the concrete operational stage, what early language capacity is the pre-operational stage, it's the border. So what is conservation? Conservation is the understanding that amount stays the same even if shape or distribution changes. So classic example, and I'm going to show a video in a second with some more examples. You take two short, fat glasses that are half full of water, they look the same amount, same shape of glass. You show the kid, if he's, let's say, 5 to 7, kind of still in the pre-operational stage, and you say, do these have the same amount of water? And the kid will say yes. You take one of them, you pour it into a tall, skinny glass, and now the water's higher, and you ask which one has more water, and they'll say the tall, skinny one, right? And that's really dumb, right? Obviously it's the same amount of water, but the kid doesn't understand that amount doesn't change just when the shape is higher and skinnier. So that's an example of a failure to understand conservation, which develops around 7. So to illustrate, I'm going to show a video with a kid who's probably partway through the pre-operational stage, failing to understand conservation. Okay, so those are the examples of failure to understand conservation. So once they understand conservation, they move into concrete operational. Around the age of 12 is when Piaget thought that kids became more fully little scientists. They are now able to engage in what we talked about in chapter 9, hypothetico-deductive thinking. So they can think in terms of hypotheticals, guesses, and derive what will be true based on that guess and test them. You can give kids little tasks, little games where they have to do this, and kids at this stage are able to do that. So they're able to think more logically, more formally than kids in earlier stages. Okay, so those are Piaget's stages. Any questions about any of them? Yes?
Is hypothetical thinking the barrier between concrete and...
Yes. So she asked, is hypothetical deductive the barrier? And yes, in that case, once you can do hypothetical deductive thinking, then you can, then you're said to be in the 4th stage. Other questions? Yes?
Does this stage, do these stages depend purely on age, or can the environment affect the kids maturity?
It's a great question. So that's the next thing I'll talk about is some of the criticisms of Piaget, and that is one that's been brought up. So I'll come right back to that. Other questions before I move on to criticisms? Okay, so Piaget's basic findings have held up fairly well, but there are some areas of criticism. One, which relates to what this person asked, is Piaget underestimated how variable kids are in terms of when they hit the various stages. Could have to do with genetic factors or environmental factors, but it's not quite as clean as Piaget thought. Another thing that Piaget underestimated is the role of culture. He sort of assumed this was just like the natural, universal way that kids would develop. But if you make this the standard for what counts as becoming fully developed, probably a kid in Papua New Guinea who's raised by hunter-gatherers will never achieve this. And that's not because they're not developing normally, it's just because they're not presented with those kinds of problems. They're learning how to hunt and gather. So no reason why they'd learn how to think like that. And lastly, particularly with regard to the sensory motor stage, it's widely argued that Piaget underestimated how much kids know at the beginning. So, like I said last time, Piaget thought that the concept of object permanence emerged at around 8 months. But there's some interesting studies finding that it's probably earlier than that, on average. And the reason for thinking this is some very clever studies involving looking time. So you present babies with simple situations, and you measure how long they look at it. And at least in these experiments, it's assumed that If a situation is more surprising, the baby will look longer. So one example is, you have someone put a doll behind a screen, and then put another doll behind the screen. If the screen goes down and there's two there, you do that over and over again, they kind of stop looking, they get bored. If you do it where you put two in behind a screen, you pull it down and there's just one, they look longer. And some have argued that's an indication of surprise. They expect it to be where if you put two behind the screen and move the screen down, there should still be two there. You can do this with like simple physics cases too, right? Like if someone lets go of a ball and it goes up, something like that, the babies are more surprised. They look longer than if you let go and it goes down. And according to the book, you get these effects as early as 4 to 5 months, so significantly earlier than Piaget thought. Okay, that's all I have to say about Piaget. Any last questions about him? Okay, the next character is Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist. He was also interested in the development of cognitive skills, and he conceptualized it sort of in spatial terms. So if you think about this as a kid growing up and gaining new cognitive skills, let's say this is when the baby's born and he or she knows almost nothing, and then here is when they're, 18 or whatever, and they've accumulated lots of skills. Let's say the baby's around 2, and underneath the line is every skill that he or she has learned. So let's say we're specifically talking about puzzles. Let's say that the kid can solve, I don't know how good they are, let's say they can solve puzzles involving up to 10 pieces. So 10 pieces, they can figure it out. And everything else, all the words they know, whatever. Piaget was interested in this region just above what they can do. So the tasks that the kid can't quite do on their own, but they can with a little bit of help from a parent or some other adult. And that was called by Vygotsky the zone of proximal development. So it's all the tasks that the kid can't quite do, but can with a little bit of help. And the term he used for the help is scaffolding. So kind of like a ladder. It's very spatial metaphor. So the job of an adult is to provide little hints to help him or her solve these problems that are just out of reach. So let's say it's puzzles that involve 15 or 20 pieces. Okay, they can't quite do it on their own. The parent has to guide them through it so they can learn the skills to do that next step in their developmental trajectory. I won't go into as much detail about the information processing theories, but one thing that they have in common with Vygotsky, and one thing that makes them different from Piaget, is information processing approaches and Vygotsky's approach view learning as more continuous. So Piaget emphasized these stages, which are nice first approximations. You can think of it as like this. If this is moving up through development, there's stage 1, stage 2, etc. But when you think about that, it's a little bit silly because it's not as if a kid is 6 years and 364 days, and then they wake up the next day and they're like, oh, I all of a sudden understand a bunch of new stuff. Obviously, it's continuous, and information processing models tend to emphasize that, right? Skills are learned continuously and not in these clean stages. The clean stages might be nice first approximations, but in reality, it's going to be continuous. Okay, there's a section on theory of mind, which I've already talked about. So theory of mind is the understanding that other people have different minds than you. And the various tests that are used to see if a kid has theory of mind are called false belief tasks. So like that example I gave with the two boxes. So there's two boxes, and one doll puts it in this box, that doll leaves. While that doll's not looking, another doll puts it in the other box. This doll comes back, where will it look? And to give the right answer, you have to be able to understand that that doll can have a false belief. Right? It doesn't know everything that you know. It may be missing some information and therefore have a false belief. And the book says these capacities tend to emerge around 4 to 6, depending on how strict you make the criteria. However, if for people with autism, this tends to not develop fully. One of the main symptoms of autism is lifelong difficulty with theory of mind, with the ability to understand other people's states of mind. Another capacity that requires theory of mind is lying. So around the time that kids start to develop theory of mind, they also start to lie. Because lying requires the understanding that I can know some things that you don't know, and I can use that to my advantage and give you false beliefs. If you don't understand that the other person doesn't have a different mind, then there's no reason why you lie. There's a brief discussion of early emotions in kids. This is sort of review from 104, but in emotion theory, it's commonly argued that there are 6 emotions for which the facial expressions are universal. This goes back to the work of Paul Ekman, who did studies in isolated societies that had very little contact with the West, and looked at whether they showed the same types of facial expressions. And there were 6 for which the evidence was quite good that the types of facial expressions were universal. Those being happiness, sadness, disgust, anger, surprise, and fear. Now, for the kid pictures, it has interest instead of surprise. I'm not going to test you on the difference there, but for at least 5 of the 6, there's clear evidence that kids show facial expressions consistent with those universal emotions that Ekman talked about, and they show them quite early. Additionally, around 18 months, kids show evidence of having self-awareness. The standard operational definition of self-awareness in psychology is something called the mirror test. You show the human or the animal a mirror, and you've put some kind of mark on its face, like lipstick or something, and you show it the mirror, and the question is, does it respond to the mirror as if that's another animal, or does it know, oh wait, that's me, there's some crap on my face, I should try to get it off. And kids pass this test at around 18 months. Some of our primate relatives can pass the test, but only as adults. Some evidence that elephants can do it. And with regard to sea mammals, it's harder to test, but some have argued that dolphins and orcas pass this test as well. But anyways, but for that, you don't need to know that. But for developmental psychologists, the important date is 18 months. That's around the time that kids start to pass the test. Okay. Another term that you should know is temperament. And there are 3 types of temperament: easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. a temperament is a kind of emotional personality style, you could say, or emotional tendency that kids have. And these appear to be kind of genetic and built in. Right when the kid's born, they seem to have one of these three tendencies. This is why my mom always used to say, don't write the parenting book until you've had more than one kid. Because you may have the first kid and have found that a certain set of techniques work, and the second kid comes along and it's not the same. So the easy temperament babies sleep very easily. They're very compliant, don't cry a lot, they're a kind of pleasant disposition. Difficult babies are very irritable, wake up a lot, cry a lot, and are more difficult to please. The slow to warm up babies are more mildly negative. They're not as irritable and not as likely to cry as the difficult ones, but they're not as pleasant as the easy ones either. They take more time to become pleasant. Okay, next is Erikson's psychosocial stages. And these are kind of a pain in the ass to memorize. So the way these stages work, these go from 0 all the way to death. So Erikson was tried to be very complete. And there are 8 stages in this theory, and each of them has 2 possible outcomes, or 2 conflicting possible outcomes. So that's 16 total terms. And of those 16 terms, 7 of them start with the letter I, which makes it very easy to mix them up. It's not my fault, it's Erikson's fault. And for some of them, there were much better words that didn't start with I. I think he did it on purpose, that's my theory. But yeah, it was very influential, so we'll go through all 16 of them. So from 0 to 2, or actually, sorry, 0 to 1, the basic conflict is between trust and mistrust. This is when breastfeeding, of course, is occurring. And Erikson, I forgot to note, was very influenced by Freud, very strongly influenced by Sigmund Freud. Freud had his own stages of development, which were pretty crazy. This is where like the mom stuff comes in and all that. And so what Erikson basically was trying to do was to take the insights of Freud and get rid of all the crazy sex stuff. So Freud thought that breastfeeding, the reason it was psychologically significant is because all of psychosexual energy was focused on the mouth. He called it the oral stage. So that's pretty crazy. But Erikson said that what's really going on is the psychological crisis is about, can I trust the world or not? Is the world going to be responsive to my needs or not? So if you go through breastfeeding well and the mother is responsive, then you become more of a trusting person. You've gone through the stage properly. The next stage is from 1 to 2, and it's autonomy versus shame and doubt. So the psychologically significant problem in this stage is potty training. This is again taken from Freud. So the dilemma or the crisis is, can I be a self-governing person and be independent? Or do I fail at doing that, and am I really kind of embarrassed and shameful about that? And the parents have a role here too. If they're too harsh about failures to potty train properly, that can also lead, of course, to shame. For 3 to 5, it's initiative versus guilt. So the kid can start to explore the environment more now. They are more mobile. Is their curiosity rewarded? Like, are they allowed to kind of explore and be curious and check out the world? Or are they punished for doing so and overly restricted? In which case they'll have more problems. 6 to 12 is industry versus inferiority. So now we're going to get a lot of the I's. This is when kids start going to school, of course. They might start trying sports and other potentially competitive tasks. And here the crisis is, can I become competent? Right? Do I do reasonably well in school? Can I be competitive in sports and other tasks like that? Or do I develop a kind of inferiority complex? Am I continually obsessed with not doing as well? "12 versus 20 is identity versus role confusion. We'll talk more about this later when we talk about adolescent development, but the basic idea here is this is when kids, or I guess teenagers now, start to think about who they are. Right? Are they going to accept the values and beliefs that have been given to them by their parents or by their society, or are they going to develop some different kind of identity? What group of people do you affiliate with? What's your belief system? Those kinds of identity questions. And if you end that stage without having a clear sense of who you are and what your values are, that's kind of the bad trajectory, the role confusion. Next, about 20 to 40 is intimacy versus isolation. So you start to get more on the dating market, right? Maybe you dated in high school, but now it's getting a bit more serious. Are you able to find a partner? Are you able to maintain your friendships from high school? Those kinds of things. Or develop new friends, or do you start to become isolated as you become an adult? Do you struggle in finding a partner or in maintaining friendships? Then that would be the isolation trajectory. "40 to 65 is generativity versus stagnation. So hopefully, if you're on the generativity path, you get a job, you become more advanced in that job, you're a productive member of the community, maybe you have some kids, you're respected and valued in various zones, including the family and the workplace. But if you stay in mom's house too long, maybe you bounce from dead-end job to dead-end job, don't start a family, those kinds of things. According to Erickson, that would be the stagnation kind of trajectory. And then lastly, 65 plus is integrity versus despair. So 65 plus, your life's kind of ending, you retire. Do you look back on your life with pride and think, yeah, I wasn't perfect, but I had a productive life. I'm proud of what I accomplished, and I'm, happy to be finishing the race? Or do you think, wow, I really blew it, I didn't really accomplish anything, now my life's over and my chances is up? Any questions about those 8 stages?
Can you just repeat the last one?
Yep, integrity versus despair. Integrity means you're satisfied with the end of your life, you think you've accomplished a lot. Despair would be, I kind of blew it, and I feel a lot of regret for the things I didn't do. Other questions? Yes?
What was that 12 to 20?
12 to 20 is identity versus role confusion. So figuring out who you are, what your values are, things like that.
How much sort of evidential credibility does this sort of structure have?
It's a good question. I'm not familiar with the research into it. Just personally, anecdotally, it seems like a lot of these, and maybe this means I didn't go through the stages properly, but I don't know, some of these I still think about now. I don't think I stopped thinking about whether I'm competent when I was 12. And I think that's pretty normal, but I don't know what the research says.
Are the outcomes of the stages connected? Like, for example, if from the identity versus role confusion state, the individual goes through the role confusion one, are they more likely to go through the isolation stage between both of them?
That's a great question. I believe so. I believe Erickson would say so, but I'm not confident enough in that answer to say that that's testable. So if you didn't hear, what he asked was, if you go through the bad trajectory on, let's say, the stage 3, like the bad outcome, does that make you more likely to do the bad outcome on the next one? And I think Erickson would say yes, but I'm not sure enough to say that that's testable. Yep.
Did this take into account the differences between cultures, or is this just?
Say again.
Was this taking into account people from different countries?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, so I'm not sure if Erickson did cross-cultural research. Oh yeah, at the back?
You say the identity versus was
Okay, you want me to repeat what the identity one is?
just the ages.
Oh, the ages. Identity is 12 to 20, I think. Yes, 12 to 20.
The PowerPoint says that it's 15 to 25.
Oh, interesting. There's different estimates in different books. The book says that. I was probably using the AP Psych book for that. Here's what I will promise. There will be no questions on the test that require you to know the difference, as long as you have a general sense of when they are. But thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Yeah, what was the age range between intimacy and isolation?
So intimacy and isolation is 20 to 40 here, but probably in the PowerPoint it's 25 to something. But like I said, I won't ask a question on the test that requires you to know which is correct, because there's conflicting estimates in that case. Okay. People like this section. Any other questions about errors? Okay. Next, we're going to talk about imprinting and attachment. This is a very interesting area. So there's a lot of work into attachment in particular to parental figures. Some of the early work was done on bird species, because bird species have a particularly intense form of attachment called imprinting. Species in which there is imprinting, that means that there's a set window, a very short window. For example, in the case of ducklings, it's about 1 to 2.5 days. Whatever moving thing they see the most of in that short window, they will assume that's their mother or their parent. And the person who did work into this was Konrad Lorenz, and he took, I think it was geese, it was some young bird species, took them away from their mother and spent time with these geese for the first few days. And for the rest of those animals' lives, they thought Lorenz was their mother. And I have a cute video of this, of them following him even when they're fully grown. Even years later, the ducks would follow Lorenz around upon hearing his voice, go for a swim with him, and follow him. The cuteness is somewhat taken away by the fact that Lorenz was a member of the Nazi Party. So that kind of ruins it, but sorry about that. I just want you all to be well informed. Yeah, not like, oh, that guy's a Nazi. Like, no, he was a literal Nazi. So, yes.
Is it frequently seen in nature that ducks respond a lot to their parents?
Say again, sorry?
Their natural parents, do they respond to and follow their own parents like that even into nature?
Yes. And then presumably it's more obvious that they would. But what this shows is that it's not because they can smell that there's a genetic relation. It's very simple. It's just whatever moving thing they see the most of in the first 2 days or so, that's what they will assume is there. Yep.
So, theoretically, could this moving thing also be something that is like in nature, inanimate, but it could be like, let's say someone dangles something in front of this bird for a really long time.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if they've tried that. It's a good question. Maybe you can do an honors thesis on it. I have another clip on imprinting. This is a light, well, I guess the Lorenz is a lighter note too, but the philosopher Dwight Schrute giving his thoughts on imprinting. Now, despite what Dwight says there, imprinting does not appear to be something that happens in humans. It's not quite that specific that whatever you see for the first 2 days you will bond with, but there is work into attachment. And the distinction is similar to one that we made back in chapter 9. There's a distinction between a critical period and a sensitive period for attachment. So a critical period is what the birds have. There's a set period where if you do not form an attachment in that period, you will never form an attachment. Whereas a sensitive period is what humans have, where in the early days and early weeks and early years, you are more sensitive and more able to form attachments, but it's not absolutely necessary that it happens like in the first 2 weeks or the first month or something like that. Another study that involved animals, and some students find this kind of disturbing for some reason, but just the picture. So if you're a little easily weirded out, they took rhesus monkeys away from their mothers and gave them 2 fake mothers. And they were interested in what is most important for forming attachment. So the metal cage-looking thing had milk. The other one didn't have milk, but it was kind of soft and cuddly. And a certain naive kind of behaviorist, say, who thinks that like reinforcement is all that matters, might say that the milk mother is the one that they're going to bond to, but in fact it's the cloth, cuddly mother. They spent most of their time with that mother, then they would run over to the other one when they were hungry, and then right back to the cuddly mother. So this was done by Harry Harlow, and he argued that this showed that contact comfort was very important, meaning physical touch and physical bonding, not just being fed. Another name that's important here, I don't think I have him in the key terms, and if I don't, then don't worry about the name, but John Bowlby, who was a psychoanalyst, who was very strongly influenced by Freud. He argued that in the early stages, there are 3 steps of development, or steps of attachment, I should say. At first, there is indiscriminate attachment, where babies are sort of responsive to everything. Every adult figure around they'll be warm and happy with, and could potentially form an attachment with. Around 3 months, there is discriminate attachment, which is slightly more narrow. They don't start hating other people yet, but there's a bit more focus on the people they see most, like their parents and other family members. And then specific attachment, which is even more narrow. And furthermore, when they have specific attachment, something else happens, which is they feel comfortable exploring the environment if the caregiver is around, right? They view the caregiver or the attachment figure as kind of a home base. As long as mom is around, I can kind of explore the environment on my own. And that begins around 7 or 8 months. 2 other things that develop around the time that specific attachment begins. I'm not going to be too picky about exact dates here, but you should know what these terms mean. Stranger anxiety. So remember, in the early stages, like before 3 months, babies just kind of love everybody. But around 6 to 18 months, they start to become nervous if a stranger is around that they don't have an attachment with. A bit further along, around 12 to 24 months, or you could say 1 to 2 years, there is separation anxiety, which is what it sounds like. If you're separated from your mom or dad or other attachment figures, you become very distressed. So during that first year, or second year, say like first to second year, when they're 1, this provides the basis for a very commonly used test of attachment, which is the strange situation test. And I believe I do have the name of the person who came up with this. She's very important, and that's Mary Ainsworth. The test is very simple. The parent, usually the mother, brings the kid into a new room. The room is in a lab. Sorry. And there's like toys to play with, and a few chairs. The mother sits down and lets the kid explore. Another person comes into the room, and the mother leaves for like a minute and then comes back. And there's 2 key things that the scientists are looking at when they watch the kid's response. How does the baby react when the mother leaves? And how does the baby react when the mother comes back? Those are the 2 key tests. And how they react to those 2 things is how you determine what the attachment style of the baby is. So we'll watch a video of secure attachment, which is the most common type and which is generally thought to be the most healthy. Secure attachment means the baby is sad when the mother leaves and happy when she comes back. That's the healthy response at this particular age. So we'll watch a video of this in action. Okay, so as I say, that would be an example of a secure attachment. There are 4 different attachment styles for babies, and I'll go through how each of them respond. So like I said, there's 2 things. Is the baby sad when the mother leaves? And is the baby happy or comforted when the mother comes back? So for secure, they are sad when the mother leaves, and they are happy when the mother comes back. Resistant attachment. They are very sad when the mother leaves. In the book it calls it anxious resistant. But they are not comforted when the mother comes back. It's like, how could you abandon me? They're still very upset. Next is avoidant attachment, or as the book calls it, anxious avoidant. These babies don't really give a shit when the mom leaves, and don't really care when she comes back. They can take it or leave it. That's their reaction. And then the last one, disorganized, which is what it sounds like, kind of difficult to interpret and inconsistent. So those are the 4 main attachment styles for infants, and this is a test that's still sometimes used. Any questions about these 4? Yeah, so it could be sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're sad, or it can mean that it's difficult to interpret, just kind of random in a mess. Yes.
With like the anxious, like the resistant attachment, what age do people grow out of that? Because like.
Oh, sometimes they don't. So the whole point of these attachment styles is that they are often and here there is definitely work on this. They are thought to be predictive of how the kids will interact with people in the future. Not 100%, and that's what I'm actually going to talk about next. So the book doesn't mention this, but I'm sure many of you are interested to see how these relate to adult attachment. I'm not actually going to add some stuff about that. But to answer your question, yes. Sometimes they don't grow out of it. I saw a hand over here somewhere.
Oh, I was gonna ask about the does it protect the future?
Okay, so same kind of question. Other questions about these four?
Do they test it with different durations of how long the mother would be for, and if that changed what style it was?
That's a good question. So she asked, do they measure how long the mother leaves, or do they vary how long the mother leaves, and whether that changes it? The answer is I don't know. That's an interesting question. Yep.
Do these attachments reflect how the mother treats the baby at home? Like,
So-
are they-
It's controversial. So one thing that's kind of interesting is, like most human traits, these actually do show some degree of heritability, which might be surprising, but there's evidence for that. Certainly Ainsworth and Bowlby thought that they were largely influenced by how the mother treats the baby, but that's controversial. I won't test her. That's a very niche thing to worry about. So this is how attachment is characterized in kids. There's a two-dimensional model. This is in the key terms. It's not in the book, but you guys might find this interesting. So for adults, attachment is conceptualized as existing on two dimensions, and there are four attachment styles that correspond pretty well to these, but they are defined in terms of their place in these two dimensions. And the two dimensions are anxiety and avoidance. And both of those can be high or low. So I'll make this low and this low. So I'll make the word like the high part. So anxiety is about how worried you are about your relationships, how afraid you are of rejection, how paranoid you are about the status of the relationships, or how worried you are about your lack of close relationships, all of the above. Avoidance is about how much you avoid getting close to people. Each of these can be high or low. So secure, in this case, has the same name as it does in Ainsworth's model, is being low in both. So you're low in, So secure means low in both. You are not anxious about your relationships, and you don't avoid closeness, meaning you are close to people. So in your romantic relationships or friendships, you get close to people and you're not constantly worried about it. Preoccupied, I don't have room to write it, but that's in the key terms. Preoccupied means you are high in anxiety, but low in avoidance. This corresponds more to resistant. So you are very clingy. You get very close to people, but you're constantly worried about it. Constantly worried about rejection, or constantly worried about the status of the relationship. If you are high in anxiety and avoidance, that's fearful, which will correspond somewhat, well, this one's probably the weakest association, with disorganized. These are people who are so worried about rejection, so high in anxiety, that they just don't form relationships. They just avoid it because it's too stressful or too panic-inducing. And then the last one is dismissive, sometimes called dismissive avoidant. These are low in anxiety but high in avoidance. So they don't get close to people, and they're not worried about that. They're like, I don't need people, whatever. So that would correspond to the avoidant one here. There is some evidence that this last one corresponds to a kind of defense mechanism. My supervisor and I were actually working on a paper about dismissive avoidant attachment style. There's different lines of evidence that they actually do care about relationships despite what they say, but their claims that, no, I'm good, bro, I don't need people, is a kind of way of coping. You won't be tested on that detail, but that's one ongoing area of research. So these are two different ways of carving up the attachment pie or whatever. This is how you do it with adults, this is how you do it with kids. Any questions about these? Yes?
In the adult chart, mental illnesses, like, have to increase on that because, like, the dismissive, I was like, a lot of, like, psychology girls and like a dismissive, so I was just
Yeah.
wondering if, like, mental illnesses could play a part.
Oh, definitely. A lot of these would be highly correlated with them. So preoccupied is very similar to certain personality disorders. Secure attachment is associated with lower rates of mental illness and lower and better well-being, etc. So there definitely are correlations between these and different types of mental illness. It's a good question. We'll talk more about that in chapter 16. Okay, other questions about these? So again, this one's not in the book, but I'll say it's tested. That's a good modern thing to know about. Modern application of Ainsworth's stuff. So what are some other ways that attachment can go wrong? So one big one is, forget about bad attachment. What about no attachment? What about kids who are completely isolated from any serious adult interaction? And tragically, there are some real world cases of this. Probably the most widely studied is Romanian orphanages. So during the reign of a Romanian dictator whose name I can't pronounce, there were,
I'll help you out with that. Ceausescu.
that.
Yeah, I'm Romanian, so I know.
You're Romanian. Oh, there you go. So he oversaw a very broken childcare system, and kids were essentially thrown in these very underfunded orphanages when they were given out to the state, and they were basically treated like animals. Food was thrown at them, and not much else, so they had no attachment in the early months of their life. After the Romanian dictatorship fell, Western governments came in to help and looked at what was going on in these orphanages. Now, as a little historical aside, I can't help but, so even though I can't pronounce this guy's name, I do know how he lost power. It's kind of a cool little story. So yes, he died on Christmas Day. So a rebellion had already begun in Romania, and he gave a speech to try to inspire calm and order, and he gave a speech to what he thought were loyal followers on live TV, and they started booing. And as soon as that was on live TV, and chaos ensued, and he was dead in 4 days, which was Christmas. So I'll show a clip of this just because it's very interesting.
Fired his way. So he was shot in the head.
So, like I say, dead in 4 days after that. So that's how the regime fell. But I also have a video of the orphanages. So this is where the psychology comes in. So they went in to help out, and they found these really underfunded orphanages. So we'll watch a video of that as well. Okay, so mostly depressing case. So the book has a discussion of studies where they compared kids who were adopted after having spent time in these institutions and kids who just were adopted through ordinary circumstances. And unsurprisingly, growing up in an orphanage in these orphanages did predict poorer attachment, various behavioral problems, and lower IQ scores because they didn't develop as well. Although, as you can see from that guy, still a remarkable degree of resilience. Because remember, like I said earlier, development for humans is a sensitive period, not a critical period. So they still were not totally without hope. Many of them did show great resilience. I'm not going to go through all the details with the next two sections. There's a section on whether daycare has negative effects on attachment, and what, if any, effects there are of divorce. Just to briefly summarize, it looks like in general for daycare, there is not a negative effect, so long as the daycares are well run and stuff like that. If there are any differences, they tend to peter out by the time the kid is in middle childhood. For divorce, there does seem to be some correlation of various behavioral problems, although interestingly enough, the effects are not as bad as living in a home with a contentious marriage, so sometimes divorce might be the better option, funny enough. Now, those studies, of course, are all correlational, which raises some concerns because you have to wonder whether it's because the divorce itself leads to problems, or if it's because many traits, like including behavioral problems, are heritable, and it could be that the types of parents who tend to get divorced also pass on traits to kids that make them more likely to have behavioral problems. But leaving aside the issue of explanation, there is a correlation between divorce and at least some difficulties. Okay, probably the last thing we'll have time for today, which still leaves quite a bit left. So probably most, or certainly a good chunk of Tuesday's class will be spent finishing chapter 12. So maybe not as much time for review. So feel free to avail yourself of course questions and office hours. Hopefully we still have some time though for review. But last thing we'll have time to talk about today is parenting style. This is Diana Baumrin's work. I believe her name is in the key chart as well. This is another model with two dimensions, emotional style and discipline style. So emotional style can either be warm or hostile. And discipline style can either be permissive or restrictive. So these are basically what they sound like. Restrictive means rules are strictly enforced. There are clear expectations that the parents have and that they are willing to ensure that the kids follow. And emotional style has to do with how loving and accepting are the parents. So according to Baumrin and according to subsequent research, authoritative is the best style. So that's where there is high restrictiveness but high warmth. So there are clear expectations and clear rules, but there is also a loving and supporting environment. A consequence of this is that the rules are clear and strict, but reasons are given. If the kid asks, why is this the rule? The answer is not because I said so, slap. That's the next one. The next one, and it's a shame they gave them such similar names, but is authoritarian. I think of an authoritarian government. So this is a parenting style that is highly strict, but also hostile, not very loving. And then the last two, the other two are indulgent, which is very permissive and loving, and neglectful, where it's hostile and not strict. So as I say, authoritative parenting is associated with the best outcomes. Authoritarian kids with authoritarian parents tend to have lower self-esteem and be less popular. kids with indulgent parents are less mature, even though they may be loving. And kids with neglectful parents have the worst outcomes on average. Yes.
So, thinking now about Gen Alpha and the fact that
Gen Alpha?
yes, which is like people who are pretty much like born after like 2012 or something like that.
Oh, okay.
But basically, with those children, we now see that they are mostly raised with like devices and iPads in hand, and they're not really given much attention from their parents. In that situation, would you say that would be closer to the neglectful side, and do you think that this will actually have a problem?
That's an interesting question. I'd be inclined to say indulgent, just because if it's not associated with low love or hostility, you would classify it as indulgent. There are studies into the effects of time on devices, but I'm not familiar with the meta-analyses. People are starting to pack up. I'll stick around if there are more questions, but I think we'll stop there. So we'll probably spend most of Tuesday finishing chapter 12, and then of course next Thursday is test number 2. See you all on Tuesday.